For a comprehensive and visible clarification to oneself of the varied sources of the arising and the varied qualities of the manifested personalities in the general organization of man, and also of the difference between what is called that I, which should be in the common presence of a man without quotation marks, that is, a real man, and as it can be expressed, the pseudo-I, which people today mistake for it. An analogy can be very well made, though this analogy, as is said, has been worn threadbare by contemporary what are called spiritualists, occultists, theosophists, and other specialists in catching fish in muddy waters, in their cackle about what are called the mental, astral, and still other such bodies, which are supposed to be in man. Nevertheless, it is well adapted to throw light on the question which we are now considering. A man as a whole, with all his separately concentrated and functioning localizations, that is to say, his formed and independently educated personalities, is almost exactly comparable to that organization for conveying a passenger, which consists of a carriage, a horse, and a coachman. It must first of all be remarked that the difference between a real man and a pseudo-man, that is, between one who has his own I and one who has not, is indicated in the analogy we have taken by the passenger sitting in the carriage. In the first case, that of the real man, the passenger is the owner of the carriage, and in the second case, he is simply the first chance passer-by who, like the fare in a hackney carriage, is continuously being changed. The body of a man, with all its motor reflex manifestations, corresponds simply to the carriage itself. All the functionings and manifestations of feeling of a man correspond to the horse, harnessed to the carriage, and drawing it. The coachman sitting on the box and directing the horse corresponds to that in a man which people call consciousness or mentation. And finally, the passenger seated in the carriage and commanding the coachman is that which is called I. The fundamental evil among contemporary people is chiefly that, owing to the rooted and widespread abnormal methods of education of the rising generation, this fourth personality, which should be present in everybody on reaching responsible age, is entirely missing in them. And almost all of them consist only of the three enumerated parts, which parts, moreover, are formed arbitrarily of themselves, and anyhow. In other words, almost every contemporary man of responsible age consists of nothing more nor less than simply a hackney carriage, and one moreover composed as follows: a broken-down carriage, which has long ago seen its day, a crock of a horse, and on the box, a tatterdemalion, half-sleepy, half-drunken coachman, whose time designated by Mother Nature for self-perfection passes while he waits on a corner, fantastically daydreaming for any old chance passenger. The first passenger who happens along hires him and dismisses him just as he pleases, and not only him, but also all the parts subordinate to him. Continuing this analogy between a typical contemporary man, with his thoughts, feelings, and body, and a hackney carriage, horse, and coachman, we can clearly see that in each of the parts composing both organizations there must have been formed, and there must exist, its own separate needs, habits, tastes, and so on, proper to it alone. From the varied nature of their arising and the diverse conditions of their formation, and according to the varying possibilities of each of them, there must inevitably have been formed, for instance, its own psyche, its own notions, its own subjective supports, its own viewpoints, and so on. The whole totality of the manifestations of human mentation, with all the inherencies proper to this functioning, and with all its specific particularities, corresponds almost exactly in every respect to the essence and manifestations of a typical hired coachman. Like all hired coachmen in general, he is a type called cabbie. He is not entirely illiterate because, owing to the regulations existing in his country for the general compulsory teaching of the 3 R's, he was obliged in his childhood to put in an occasional attendance at what is called the parish church school. Although he himself is from the country and has remained as ignorant as his fellow rustics, yet rubbing shoulders, owing to his profession, with people of various positions and education, picking up from them by bits here and bits there a variety of expressions embodying various notions, he has now come to regard everything smacking of the country with superiority and contempt, indignantly dismissing it all as ignorance. In short, this is a type to whom applies perfectly the definition, "The crows he raced, but by peacocks outpaced." He considers himself competent even in questions of religion, politics, and sociology. With his equals he likes to argue. Those whom he regards his inferiors he likes to teach. His superiors he flatters. With them he is servile. Before them, as is said, he stands cap in hand. One of his chief weaknesses is to dangle after the neighboring cooks and housemaids. But best of all, he likes a good hearty tuck-in, and to gulp down another glass or two, and then, fully satiated, drowsily to daydream. To gratify these weaknesses of his, he always steals a part of the money given him by his employer to buy fodder for the horse. Like every cabbie, he works, as is said, always under the lash, and if occasionally he does a job without being paid, it is only in the hope of receiving tips. The desire for tips has gradually taught him to be aware of certain weaknesses in the people with whom he has dealings, and to profit himself by them. He has automatically learned to be cunning, to flatter, so to say, to stroke people the right way, and, in general, to lie. On every convenient occasion, and at every free moment, he slips into a saloon or to a bar where, over a glass of beer, he daydreams for hours at a time, or talks with a type like himself, or just reads the paper. He tries to appear imposing, wears a beard, and if he is thin, pads himself out to appear more important. The totality of the manifestations of the feeling localization in a man, and the whole system of its functioning, correspond perfectly to the horse of the hackney carriage in our analogy. Incidentally, this comparison of the horse with the organization of human feeling will serve to show up particularly clearly the error and one-sidedness of the contemporary education of the rising generation. The horse, as a whole, owing to the negligence of those around it during its early years, and to its constant solitude, is as if locked up within itself. That is to say, its, so to say, inner life is driven inside, and for external manifestations it has nothing but inertia. Thanks to the abnormal conditions around it, the horse has never received any special education, but has been molded exclusively under the influence of constant thrashing and vile abuse. It has always been kept tied up, and for food, instead of oats and hay, there is given to it merely straw, which is utterly worthless for its real needs. Never having seen in any of the manifestations towards it even the least love or friendliness, the horse is now ready to surrender itself completely to anybody who gives it the slightest caress. The consequence of all this is that all the inclinations of the horse, deprived of all interests and aspirations, must inevitably be concentrated on food, drink, and the automatic yearning toward the opposite sex. Hence it invariably veers in the direction where it can obtain any of these, If, for example, it catches sight of a place where, even once or twice, it gratified one of the enumerated needs, it waits the chance to run off in that direction. It must further be added that although the coachman has a very feeble understanding of his duties, he can nevertheless, even though only a little, think logically. And remembering tomorrow, he either from fear of losing his job or from the desire of receiving a reward, does occasionally evince an interest in doing something or other for his employer without being driven to it. But the horse, in consequence of their not having been formed in it at the proper time, owing to the absence of any special and corresponding education, any data at all for manifesting the aspirations requisite for responsible existence, of course fails to understand, and indeed it cannot be expected that it should understand. Why, in general, it must do anything. Its obligations are therefore carried out quite inertly and only from fear of further beatings. As far as the carriage or cart is concerned, which stands in our analogy for the body, without any of the other independently formed parts of the common presence of a man, the situation is even worse. This cart, like most carts, is made of various materials and furthermore is of a very complicated construction. It was designed, as is evident to every sane-thinking man, to carry all kinds of burdens, and not for the purpose for which contemporary people employ it, that is, only for carrying passengers. The chief cause of the various misunderstandings connected with it springs from the fact that those who made the system of this cart intended it for travel on the by-roads, and certain inner details of its general construction were in consequence foreseeingly made to answer to this aim. For example, the principle of its greasing, one of the chief needs of a construction of such different materials, was so devised that the grease should spread over all the metallic parts from the shaking received from the jolts inevitable on such roads. Whereas now, this cart that was designed for traveling on the by-roads finds itself stationed on a rank in the city and traveling on smooth, level, asphalted roads. In the absence of any shocks whatsoever while going along such roads, no uniform greasing of all its parts occurs, and some of them consequently must inevitably rust and cease to fulfill the action intended for them. A cart goes easily, as a rule, if its moving parts are properly greased. With too little grease, these parts get heated and finally red hot, and thus the other parts get spoiled. On the other hand, if in some part there is too much grease, the general movement of the cart is impaired, and in either case it becomes more difficult for the horse to draw it. The contemporary coachman or cabby neither knows nor has any suspicion of the necessity of greasing the cart, and even if he does grease it, he does so without proper knowledge, only on hearsay, blindly following the directions of the first comer. That is why when this cart, now adapted more or less for travel on smooth roads, has for some reason or other to go along a by-road, something always happens to it. Either a nut gives way, or a bolt gets bent, or something or other gets loose. And after these attempts at traveling along such roads, the journey rarely ends without more or less considerable repairs. In any case, to make use of this cart for the purposes for which it was made is already impossible without risk. If repairs are begun, it is necessary to take the cart all to pieces, examine all its parts, and, as is done in such cases, kerosene them, clean them, and put them together again. And frequently it becomes clearly necessary, immediately and without fail, to change a part. This is all very well if it happens to be an inexpensive part, but it may turn out to be more costly than a new cart. And so, all that has been said about the separate parts of that organization of which, taken as a whole, a hackney carriage consists, can be fully applied also to the general organization of the common presence of a man. Owing to the absence among contemporary people of any knowledge and ability specially to prepare in a corresponding way the rising generation for responsible existence by educating all the separate parts composing their common presences, every person of today is a confused and extremely ludicrous something. That is to say, again using this example we have taken, a something resembling the following picture. A carriage, just out of the factory, made on the latest model, polished by German craftsmen from the town of Barmen, and harnessed to the kind of horse, which is called in the locality named Transcaucasia, a Dglozidi. D is a horse, Dgloz is the name of a certain Armenian specialist in buying utterly worthless horses and skinning them. On the box of this stylish carriage sits an unshaven, unkempt, sleepy coachman cabby, dressed in a shabby cloak which he has retrieved from the rubbish heap where it had been thrown as utterly worthless by the kitchen maid Maggie. On his head reposes a brand new top hat, an exact replica of Rockefeller's, and in his buttonhole there is displayed a giant chrysanthemum. This picture, however ludicrous, of contemporary man is an inevitable result chiefly because from the first day of the arising and formation of contemporary man, all these three parts formed in him, which parts, although diversely caused and with properties of diverse quality, should nevertheless, at the period of his responsible existence for pursuing a single aim, altogether represent his entire whole, begin, so to say, to live, and to become fixed in their specific manifestations separately one from another, never having been trained either to the requisite automatic reciprocal maintenance, reciprocal assistance, or to any, even though only approximate, reciprocal understanding. And thus, when afterwards concerted manifestations are required, these concerted manifestations do not appear. Thanks to what is called the system of education of the rising generation, which at the present time has already been completely fixed in the life of man, and which consists singly and solely in training the pupils by means of constant repetition to the point of madness, to sense various almost empty words and expressions, and to recognize only by the difference in their consonants the reality supposed to be signified by these words and expressions. The coachman is still able to explain after a fashion the various desires arising in him, but only to types similar to his own, outside of his common presence. And he is sometimes even able approximately to understand others. This coachman cabby of ours, gossiping with other coachmen while waiting for a fare, and sometimes, as is said, flirting at the gate of the neighbor's maid, even learns various forms of what is called amiability. He also, by the way, according to the external conditions of the life of coachmen in general, gradually automatizes himself to distinguish one street from the other, and to calculate, for instance, during repairs in some street, how to get to the required street from another direction. But as for the horse, although the maleficent invention of contemporary people, which is called education, does not extend over the horse's formation, and in consequence its inherited possibilities are not atrophied, yet owing to the fact that this formation proceeds under the conditions of the abnormally established process of the ordinary existence of people, and that the horse grows up ignored like an orphan by everybody, and moreover an ill-treated orphan, it neither acquires anything corresponding to the established psyche of the coachman, nor learns anything of what he knows, and hence is quite ignorant of all the forms of reciprocal relationship which have become usual for the coachman, and no contact is established between them for understanding each other. It is possible, however, that in its locked-in life, the horse does nevertheless learn some form of relationship with the coachman, and that even, perhaps, it is familiar with some language. But the trouble is that the coachman does not know this, and does not even suspect its possibility. Apart from the fact that, owing to the said abnormal conditions, no data for even an approximate understanding of each other are formed between the horse and the coachman, there are also still other and numerous external causes independent of them, which fail to give them the possibility of together actualizing that one purpose for which they were both destined. The point is that just as the separate independent parts of the hackney are connected, namely the carriage to the horse by the shafts, and the horse to the coachman by the reins, so also are the separate parts of the general organization of man connected with each other. Namely, the body is connected to the feeling organization by the blood, and the feeling organization is connected to the organization actualizing the functioning of mentation or consciousness by what is called handbledzoin. That is, by that substance which arises in the common presence of a man from all intentionally made efforts. The wrong system of education existing at the present time has led to the coachman's ceasing to have any effect whatever on his horse, unless we allow the fact that he is merely able by means of the reins to engender in the consciousness of the horse just three ideas: right, left, and stop. Strictly speaking, he cannot always do even this, because the reins in general are made of materials that react to various atmospheric phenomena. For example, during a pouring rain they swell and contract, and in heat the contrary, thereby changing their effect upon the horse's automatized sensitiveness of perception. The same proceeds in the general organization of the average man whenever from some impression or other the, so to say, density and tempo of the handbledzoin changes in him, when his thoughts entirely lose all possibility of affecting his feeling organization. And so, to resume all that has been said, one must willy-nilly acknowledge that every man should strive to have his own eye. Otherwise he will always represent a hackney carriage in which any fare can sit, and which any fare can dispose of just as he pleases. And here it will not be superfluous to point out that the Institute for the Harmonious Development of Man, organized on the system of Mr. Gurdjieff, has, among its fundamental tasks, also the task of, on the one hand, correspondingly educating in its pupils each of the enumerated independent personalities separately as well as in their general reciprocal relationship, and on the other hand, of begetting and fostering in each of its pupils what every bearer of the name of man without quotation marks should have: his own eye. For a more exact, so to say, scientific definition of the difference between a genuine man, that is, man as he ought to be, and a man who we have called man in quotation marks, that is, such men as almost all contemporary people have become, it is fitting to repeat what was said about this by Mr. Gurdjieff himself in one of his personal lecture talks. It was as follows: for the definition of man, considered from our point of view, neither anatomical nor physiological nor psychological, contemporary knowledge of his symptoms can assist us. Since they are inherent in one degree or another in every man and consequently apply equally to all. Hence they do not enable us to establish the exact difference which we wish to establish between people. This difference can only be formulated in the following terms. Man is a being who can do, and to do means to act consciously and by one's own initiative. And indeed, every more or less sane-thinking man who is able to be, if only a little impartial, must admit that hitherto there has not been, nor can there be, a fuller and more exhaustive definition. Even suppose that we provisionally accept this definition. The question inevitably arises, can a man who is a product of contemporary education and civilization do anything at all himself, consciously and by his own will? No, we answer at the very beginning to this question. Why not? Solely because, as the Institute for the Harmonious Development of Man experimentally proves, and from experiments categorically affirms, everything without exception from beginning to end does itself in contemporary man, and there is nothing which a contemporary man himself does. In personal, family, and communal life, in politics, science, art, philosophy, and religion, in short, in everything entering into the process of the ordinary life of a contemporary man, everything from beginning to end does itself. And not a single one of these victims of contemporary civilization can do anything. This experimentally proved categorical affirmation of the Institute for the Harmonious Development of Man, namely that the ordinary man can do nothing, and that everything does itself in him and through him, coincides with what is said of man by contemporary exact positive science. Contemporary exact positive science says that a man is a very complex organism developed by evolution from the simplest organisms, and who has now become capable of reacting in a very complex manner to external impressions. This capability of reacting in man is so complex, and the responsive movements can appear to be so far removed from the causes evoking them and conditioning them, that the actions of man, or at least a part of them, seem to naive observation quite spontaneous. But according to the ideas of Mr. Gurdjieff, the average man is indeed incapable of the single smallest independent or spontaneous action or word. All of him is only the result of external effect. Man is a transforming machine, a kind of transmitting station of forces. Thus, from the point of view of the totality of Mr. Gurdjieff's ideas, and also according to contemporary exact positive science, man differs from the animals only by the greater complexity of his reactions to external impressions, and by having a more complex construction for perceiving and reacting to them. And as to that which is attributed to man and named will, Mr. Gurdjieff completely denies the possibility of its being in the common presence of the average man. Will is a certain combination obtained from the results of certain properties specially elaborated in themselves by people who can do. In the presences of average people, what they call will is exclusively only the resultant of desires. Real will is a sign of a very high degree of being in comparison with the being of an ordinary man. But only those people who possess such being can do. All other people are simply automatons, machines or mechanical toys set in motion by external forces, acting just insofar as the spring placed in them by surrounding accidental conditions acts. And this spring can neither be lengthened or shortened, nor changed in any way on its own initiative. And so, while admitting great possibilities in man, we deny him any value as an independent unit, as long as he remains such as he is at the present time. For the purpose of confirming the complete absence in the average man of any will whatsoever, I will add here a passage from another of Mr. Gurdjieff's personal lectures, in which the manifestations of this famous assumed will in man are picturesquely described. Addressing those present, Mr. Gurdjieff then said, "You have plenty of money, luxurious conditions of existence, and universal esteem and respect. At the head of your well-established concerns are people absolutely reliable and devoted to you. In a word, your life is a bed of roses. You dispose of your time as you please. You are a patron of the arts. You settle world questions over a cup of coffee. You are even interested in the development of the latent spiritual forces in man. You are not unfamiliar with the needs of the spirit, and are well versed in philosophical matters. You are well educated and widely read. Having a great deal of learning on all kinds of questions, you are reputed to be a clever man, being at home in a variety of fields. You are a model of culture. All who know you regard you as a man of great will, and most of them even attribute all your advantages to the results of the manifestations of this will of yours. In short, from every point of view, you are fully deserving of imitation, and a man to be envied. In the morning you wake up under the impression of some oppressive dream. Your slightly depressed state, that dispersed on awakening, has nevertheless left its mark. A certain languidness and hesitancy in your movements. You go to the mirror to comb your hair and carelessly drop the brush. You have only just picked it up when you drop it again. You then pick it up with a shade of impatience, and in consequence you drop it a third time. You try to catch it as it is falling, but from an unlucky blow of your hand, the brush makes for the mirror. In vain you rush to save it. Crack! There is a star of cracks on that antique mirror of which you were so proud. Damn, devil take it! And you experience a need to vent your fresh annoyance on someone or other, and not finding the newspaper beside your morning coffee, the servant having forgotten to put it there, the cup of your patience overflows, and you decide that you cannot stand the fellow any longer in the house. It is time for you to go out. The weather being pleasant, and not having far to go, you decide to walk. Behind you glides your new automobile of the latest model. The bright sunshine somewhat calms you, and a crowd which has collected at the corner attracts your attention. You go nearer, and in the middle of the crowd you see a man lying unconscious on the pavement. A policeman, with the help of some of the, as they are called, idlers who have collected, puts the man into a taxi to take him to the hospital. Thanks merely to the likeness which has struck you between the face of the chauffeur and the face of the drunkard you bumped into last year when you were returning somewhat tipsy yourself from a rowdy birthday party, you notice that the accident on the street corner is unaccountably connected in your associations with a meringue you ate at that party. Ah, what a meringue that was! That servant of yours, forgetting your newspaper today, spoiled your coffee. Why not make up for it at once? Here is a fashionable cafe where you sometimes go with your friends. But why did you recall the servant? Had you not almost entirely forgotten the morning's annoyance? But now, how very good this meringue tastes with the coffee. Look, there are two ladies at the next table. What a charming blonde. You hear her whispering to her companion, glancing at you. Now he is the sort of man I like. Do you deny that from these words about you, accidentally overheard and perhaps intentionally said aloud, the whole of you, as is said, inwardly rejoices? Suppose that at this moment you were asked whether it had been worthwhile getting fussed and losing your temper over the morning's annoyances. You would of course answer in the negative and promise yourself that nothing of this kind should ever occur again. Need you be told how your mood was transformed while you were making the acquaintance of the blonde in whom you were interested, and who was interested in you, and its state during all the time you spent with her? You return home humming some air, and even the sight of the broken mirror only elicits a smile from you. But how about the business on which you had gone out this morning? You only just remember it. Clever. Well, never mind, you can telephone. You go to the phone and the girl connects you with the wrong number. You ring again and get the same number. Some man informs you that you are bothering him. You tell him it's not your fault, and that with one word and another you learn to your surprise that you are a scoundrel and an idiot, and that if you ring him up again, then a rug slipping under your feet provokes a storm of indignation, and you should hear the tone of voice in which you rebuke the servant who is handing you a letter. The letter is from a man you esteem and whose good opinion you highly value. The contents of the letter are so flattering to you that as you read, your irritation gradually passes and changes to the pleasant embarrassment of a man listening to a eulogy of himself. You finish reading the letter in the happiest of moods. I could continue this picture of your day, you free man. Perhaps you think I am overdrawing. No, it is a photographically exact snapshot from nature. While speaking of the will of man and of the various aspects of its supposedly self-initiated manifestations, which for contemporary what are called inquiring minds, but according to our reasoning, naive minds, are matters for wiseacring and self-adulation, it will do no harm to quote what was said by Mr. Gurdjieff in another conversational lecture, because the totality of what he then said may well throw light on the illusoriness of that will which every man supposedly has. Mr. Gurdjieff said, "A man comes into the world like a clean sheet of paper, which immediately all around him begin vying with each other to dirty and fill up with education, morality, the information we call knowledge, and with all kinds of feelings of duty, honor, conscience, and so on and so forth. And each and all claim immutability and infallibility for the methods they employ for grafting these branches onto the main trunk called man's personality. The sheet of paper gradually becomes dirty, and the dirtier it becomes, that is to say, the more a man is stuffed with ephemeral information, and those notions of duty, honor, and so on which are dinned into him or suggested to him by others, the cleverer and worthier is he considered by those around him. And seeing that people look upon his dirt as merit, he himself inevitably comes to regard this same dirtied sheet of paper in the same light. And so you have a model of what we call a man, to which frequently are added such words as talent and genius. And the temper of our talent, when it wakes up in the morning, is spoiled for the whole day if it does not find its slippers beside its bed. The ordinary man is not free in his manifestations, in his life, in his moods. He cannot be what he would like to be, and what he considers himself to be. He is not that. Man, how mighty it sounds. The very name man means the acme of creation. But how does his title fit contemporary man? At the same time, man should indeed be the acme of creation, since he is formed with and has in himself all the possibilities for acquiring all the data exactly similar to the data in the actualizer of everything existing in the whole of the universe. To possess the right to the name of man, one must be one. And to be such, one must first of all, with an indefatigable persistence and an unquenchable impulse of desire, issuing from all the separate independent parts constituting one's entire common presence. That is to say, with a desire issuing simultaneously from thought, feeling, and organic instinct. Work on an all-round knowledge of oneself. At the same time, struggling unceasingly with one's subjective weaknesses. And then afterwards, taking one's stand upon the results thus obtained by one's consciousness alone, concerning the defects in one's established subjectivity as well as the elucidated means for the possibility of combating them, strive for their eradication without mercy towards oneself. Speaking frankly and wholly without partiality, contemporary man as we know him is nothing more nor less than merely a clockwork mechanism, though a very complex construction. About this mechanicality, a man must without fail think deeply from every aspect and with an entire absence of partiality and well understand it, in order fully to appreciate what significance that mechanicality and all its involved consequences and results may have both for his own further life as well as for the justification of the sense and aim of his arising and existence. For one who desires to study human mechanicality in general, and to make it clear to himself, the very best object of study is he himself, with his own mechanicality. And to study this practically and to understand it sensibly, with all one's being, and not psychopathetically, that is, with one part of one's entire presence, is possible only as a result of correctly conducted self-observation. And as regards this possibility of correctly conducting self-observation and conducting it without the risk of incurring the maleficent consequences which have more than once been observed from people's attempts to do this without proper knowledge, it is necessary that the warning must be given in order to avoid the possibility of excessive zeal, that our experience, based on the vast exact information we have, has shown that this is not so simple a thing as at first glance it may appear. This is why we make the study of the mechanicality of contemporary man the groundwork of a correctly conducted self-observation. Before beginning to study this mechanicality and all the principles for a correctly conducted self-observation, a man in the first place must decide once and forever that he will be sincere with himself unconditionally, will shut his eyes to nothing, shun no results wherever they may lead him, be afraid of no inferences, and be limited by no previous self-imposed limits. And secondly, in order that the elucidation of these principles may be properly perceived and transubstantiated in the followers of this new teaching, it is necessary to establish a corresponding form of language, since we find the established form of language quite unsuitable for such elucidations. As regards the first condition, it is necessary now at the very outset to give warning that a man unaccustomed to think and act along lines corresponding to the principles of self-observation must have great courage to accept sincerely the inferences obtained and not to lose heart, and submitting to them to continue those principles further with the crescendo of persistence obligatorily requisite for this. These inferences may, as is said, upset all the convictions and beliefs previously deep-rooted in a man, as well as also the whole order of his ordinary mentation. And in that event, he may be robbed, perhaps forever, of all the pleasant, as is said, values dear to his heart, which have hitherto made up his calm and serene life. Thanks to correctly conducted self-observation, a man will, from the first days, clearly grasp and indubitably establish his complete powerlessness and helplessness in the face of literally everything around him. With the whole of his being, he will be convinced that everything governs him, everything directs him. He neither governs nor directs anything at all. He is attracted and repelled not only by everything animate, which has in itself the capacity to influence the arising of some or other association in him, but even by entirely inert and inanimate things. Without any self-imagination or self-calming, impulses which have become inseparable from contemporary men, he will cognize that his whole life is nothing but a blind reacting to the said attractions and repulsions. He will clearly see how his what are called world outlooks, views, character, taste, and so on are all molded, in short, how his individuality was formed, and under what influences its details are liable to change. And as regards the second indispensable condition, that is, the establishment of a correct language, this is necessary because our still recently established language, which has procured, so to say, rights of citizenship, and in which we speak, convey our knowledge and notions to others, and write books, has, in our opinion, already become such as to be now quite worthless for any more or less exact exchange of opinions. The words of which our contemporary language consists convey, owing to the arbitrary thought people put into them, indefinite and relative notions, and are therefore perceived by average people elastically. In obtaining just this abnormality in the life of man, a part was played, in our opinion, by always that same established abnormal system of education of the rising generation. And it played a part because, based, as we have already said, chiefly on compelling the young to learn by rote as many words as possible differentiated one from the other, only by the impression received from their consonants and not by the real pith of the meaning put into them. This system of education has resulted in the gradual loss in people of the capacity to ponder and reflect upon what they are talking about and upon what is being said to them. As a result of the loss of this capacity, and in view, at the same time, of the necessity to convey thoughts more or less exactly to others, they are obliged, in spite of the endless number of words already existing in all contemporary languages, either to borrow from other languages or to invent always more and more words, which has finally brought about that when a contemporary man wishes to express an idea for which he knows many apparently suitable words, and expresses this idea in a word which seems, according to mental reflection, to be fitting, he still instinctively feels uncertain whether his choice is correct, and unconsciously gives this word his own subjective meaning. Owing on the one hand to this already automatized usage, and on the other hand to the gradual disappearance of the capacity to concentrate his active attention for any length of time, the average man, on uttering or hearing any word, involuntarily emphasizes and dwells upon this or that aspect of the notion conveyed by the word, invariably concentrating the whole meaning of the word upon one feature of the notion indicated by it. That is to say, the word signifies for him not all the implications of the given idea, but merely the first chance significance dependent upon the ideas formed in the link of automatic associations flowing in him. Hence, every time that in the course of conversation the contemporary man hears or speaks one and the same word, he gives it another meaning, at times quite contradictory to the sense conveyed by the given word. For any man who has become aware of this to some degree, and has learned more or less to observe this tragic-comic feast of sound, is particularly sharply constated and made evident when others join the conversation of two contemporary people. Each of them puts his own subjective sense into all the words that have become gravity center words in the said, so to say, symphony of words without content. And to the ear of this impartial observer, it is all perceived only as what is called in the ancient Sino-Kulupianian tales of the 1001 Nights, cacophonous, fantastic nonsense. Conversing in this fashion, contemporary people nevertheless imagine they understand one another and are certain that they are conveying their thoughts to each other. We, on the other hand, relying upon a mass of indisputable data confirmed by psycho-physico-chemical experiments, categorically affirm that as long as contemporary people remain as they are, that is to say, average people, they will never, whatever they may be talking about among themselves, and particularly if the subject be abstract, understand the same notions by the same words, nor will they ever actually comprehend one another. This is why in contemporary average man, every inner experience and every painful experience which engenders mentation, and which has obtained logical results, which might in other circumstances be very beneficent to those round about, is not manifested outwardly, but is only transformed into, so to say, an enslaving factor for him himself. Thanks to this, even the isolation of the inner life of each individual man is increased, and as a consequence, what is called the mutual instruction, so necessary to people's collective existence, is always more and more destroyed.